The Committee of the Mind, April 22nd, 2022. We have that phrase in English, to make up your mind. It's an interesting way of saying, to decide. So make up your mind that you're going to stay right here with one thing, with the breath. Make that your intention and try to maintain that intention all the way through the hour. You have to keep repeating it to yourself, because other intentions will come in. It's as if the mind is many minds. That's why we talk about the committee of the mind, or why Ajahn Lee talks about the various consciousnesses in your body. So let's just look at the committee. There are different voices in there with different agendas, and as you meditate, you're trying to convert them all to this agenda of staying with the breath. One way you can do that is to make the breath really interesting. Of course, the breath is already interesting on its own, but you're learning how to take an interest in it, noticing how it comes in and how it goes out, what effect it has on the body, and how the in and out breath relates to the other energies in the body. We here in the West don't have much of a vocabulary for describing how the body feels from inside. The Buddha describes it in terms of properties or elements. Wind is his way of describing the energy. Then there's earth, which is the solidity of the body, fire, which is the warmth, and water, which is the coolness. Then there's space permeating the body, and space surrounding the body. Of these various elements, the wind or breath is the one most responsive to the mind, and it's also the one that most readily has an effect on the other physical elements. So we're focusing here on this sense of energy in the body. How do you picture it to yourself? This is another way of making the breath interesting. You can think of the air coming in and out through the nose, but when the Buddha talks about breath, he's talking more about the energy flow as you feel it in the body. The main energy flow you're going to notice at first is the energy flow that brings the air in and out. When you do that, are there parts of the body that have to tense up? Why? You can question that. That's a perception you're holding in mind, and it may not be the best perception for right now. You want to find a perception that allows the breath energy to flow smoothly throughout the body so that the body feels nourished, the nerves feel nourished, the blood vessels feel nourished, everything. So try different perceptions to see what helps. One that I've found useful is thinking of the body as like a big sponge. As you breathe in, the air can come in from all directions. The energy allows it to come in from all directions, and there are openings all around. You're not restricted just to the nose. Once I had a cold during my first year as a monk, and I found it really useful to think about the breath coming in not just through the nose, but also through other parts of the body, all the parts of the body. Another time, years later, when I had malaria, it got so that my breathing was really laborious. The malaria parasites were eating up all my red blood cells, so the muscles weren't getting much oxygen. The ones that were doing most of the breathing were getting fatigued. I realized I'd been holding on to one perception of the breath that required one set of muscles to keep on doing the work. I found that if I would hold to different perceptions of the main spot in the body where the breath is coming in and going out, that set of muscles could get a rest. Other muscles would move in and take over the job. When they got tired, I could change the image again. That right there, I think, is really fascinating, that the image we have of the breath will have an influence on how we actually feel the breath. So even something as simple as breathing in and out is not a given, it's something we shape. As we meditate, we can explore the limits of how far we can shape it. It's not infinite. We can't do anything at all that we want with it, but we do have some leeway that we wouldn't have noticed if we hadn't sat here for a while with the breath and started thinking about how we visualize it to ourselves. This is what I mean by making the breath interesting, because what's really interesting about this, of course, is what the mind is doing, even with something as simple as this. One of the Buddha's basic teachings is that we suffer from ignorance. In particular, we're largely ignorant of what our minds are doing. Yet this is probably the most fascinating thing in the world. When Ajahn Sawat came to America, he went around to different cities, he went to some of the national parks. Then, when he went back to Thailand, people asked him what he found most impressive about America. He said he didn't find anything impressive at all because all of our ingenuity went into material things. Very little went into understanding the mind in a way that could put an end to suffering. That's probably the most interesting issue of all. Why is it that even though we want happiness, even though we want pleasure, we end up doing things that cause suffering and stress? Why is that? What is it that we don't know about what we're doing? This is why we meditate. We start out with the breath as our focus, but we're not here to get the breath, we're here to get the mind. But to get the mind, you need to focus it on one thing. There has to be something in the present moment that's interesting and comfortable at the same time, so learn how to make the breath comfortable. This is what the directed thought and evaluation are all about. It's like moving into a house. When you first come in, it's just empty walls, empty rooms. You realize you have to furnish it. You have to make it comfortable if you're going to stay. When you do, then over time it does become a home, and it's the same with the present moment. The more you stay here, the more you understand about it, then the more you find that there are potentials for comfort in the body. The mind can feel soothed and eased simply by having one thing to think about, not having to worry about issues outside. That's one way of getting the committee together, by making the breath and issues around the breath a topic of interest. Now, there will be some committee members who say, well, that's okay for a while, but after a while you want to change. This is where you have to ask, who's talking here? What's the agenda? Where are these voices coming from? During my first year as a monk, I found myself up on a hilltop with lots of time on my hands. Voices were going through my head saying, this is a waste of time. You're not helping anybody. You should be out there doing something for society. All kinds of reasons for not being there, sitting on the hilltop, watching my breath. One of the ways I got through that period was to begin identifying the different voices. Whose attitude was that, and whose attitude was that? I began to realize that there were lots of different people from my past in my head. I had to question, what do they know? Have they ever meditated? Have they ever been exposed to these teachings? In my case, none of the voices in my head had been exposed, but they had a very strong sense of territory. My mind was their territory. This is another reason why the Buddha teaches so much about the suffering we cause ourselves. We don't take on new ideas unless we see that our old ideas are not working. The things we think will give us pleasure are actually giving us pain. The things we think are solving problems are actually creating problems. When you can see that, that's when the committee is willing to admit a few new members in, but even then it's pretty grudging. They admit them for a while and then say, well, the good you're doing isn't instantaneous. I'm not getting results right away. This must be wrong. This is where you have to argue. Again, this is strange. One mind arguing with itself. So again, think of not as one mind, but as many states of becoming, as the Buddha would call them. Each of these voices surrounds a desire, takes on an identity around that desire, and has a particular view of the world around that desire. This is where it's good to think of all four of the Buddha's noble truths. We focus our main attention on the fourth, which is the path to the end of suffering, because that's what we have to work at hardest. But it's good to keep in mind that the Buddha promises that there is such a thing as the end of suffering. There was one Dhamma teacher I heard one time saying, I don't know about the end of suffering, but I've learned that suffering is manageable. She called that the third and a half noble truth, which is rating it too high. It's not even half of a truth, and not at all noble. The Buddha wasn't here just for pain management or stress management. He said it is possible totally to put an end to suffering, totally to put an end to the stresses and difficulties that weigh the mind down. So hold that out as an option, because the other voices in the mind tend not to believe that. Their idea of happiness is a lot more limited. But we can expand our ideas of what's possible as we admit some of the Buddha's voices into our heart and mind. That's what we're doing as we meditate. He's teaching us new ways to breathe, new ways to talk to ourselves, new ways of applying perceptions to the world, all three of the fabrications that go into shaping the present moment. To really take them on, it's good to keep in mind that it is possible to put an end to suffering. There's something better than the ways we've been looking for happiness in the world so far. So a large part of the meditation is keeping some order in your committee meetings, learning how to talk to yourself, what the Buddha calls directed thought and evaluation. An important part of making sure that the conversation stays on track is directing it, so that the topic of conversation is always relevant to this issue of wholehearted concentration. July 11, 2023. Samadhi, the word that we translate as concentration, is defined in the canon as siddhisakagata, singleness of mind. It's worth exploring the levels of meaning of that term. There's the singleness. Eka means one. Aga is a controversial term. Some people translate it as point to convey the idea that your awareness should be reduced to one point, like the point of a pencil. But in Pali, it doesn't mean point. It means the summit of something, the tip, the ridge line of a roof, the top of something. It also means a gathering place. The Uposathaga is where the monks meet together to have their Uposatha. The Bhattaga, the Mealaga, is where the monks meet to have their meals. And because we're said to enter and remain or dwell in a dwelling concentration, that seems to be the more relevant meaning. We have one place where we dwell, one topic that we dwell on. Like the breath right now, gather the mind around the breath. If you're going to be thinking, think about the breath. If you're going to be asking questions or exploring, ask questions about and explore the breath. You do this singly in the sense that this is the one topic you're going to focus your mental activities on. If you really want to know this, give it your full attention. As you go through the day, you have to split your attention between the breath and the things you're doing outside. But right now, while you're sitting here, there's nothing else you have to pay attention to. You can give your all to the breath. This connects with the two meanings of citta. It can mean mind, but it can also mean heart. You want to do this with your whole heart. Ajahn Lee uses the term temsai, literally, full heart, which in ordinary Thai is an idiom meaning to do something willingly. But he also uses it to mean to do it wholeheartedly. Realize that if there's anything to be found in the practice, it's going to be found right here. Spread your awareness to fill the whole body. Or instead of thinking of spreading your awareness, you might think, wake up your awareness. That's another term that Ajahn Lee uses. Our awareness in our head tends to be pretty awake, but unless we're actively engaged in some physical skill, our awareness in the rest of the body seems to be pretty much asleep. You don't have the whole heart, you don't have the whole mind fully awake, fully alert. So wake up your alertness in your feet. Wake up your alertness in your hands, in your arms, in your legs, in your torso, all around. If you're using a meditation word, think of every cell in the body saying that meditation word. If you're focusing on the breath in and of itself, okay, every cell of the body is breathing in, breathing out. Everywhere there's a nerve end, think of its being awake to the breathing in and breathing out of every cell. Be fully present, willingly present, wholeheartedly present. All too often our concentration gets cut off because we're partly here and partly not here. There are parts of the mind that can think of other things to do, other things to think about. You've got a whole hour. You can give part of it to something else and then come back to the breath. That's what they say. But why fall for them? Remember, you're here voluntarily. You're here to meditate because you see that meditation is going to be good for you. The more you give yourself to the meditation, the more you're going to receive. So don't hold back. We sometimes have a sense of being perched in our bodies, like a bird perched on our shoulders, looking through our eyes, listening through our ears, but withdrawn from the rest of the body. Well, get back down into the body, give it your all. It's only then that you can get the full nourishment out of the meditation. The Buddha talks about a sense of ease and well-being spreading through the body. This is how you spread it, by opening up all the channels inside, waking up everybody inside. Ajahn Lee makes a comparison with putting roads and running electric lines through a former wasteland, so that now you can have communication, you can have transportation coming and going, you don't have to push the breath around. Simply open things up in the body, so that the breath can flow on its own. It's the same as when you build roads. You don't have to push the cars around the roads. Simply make sure that the roads are open and in good repair, and the cars will go on their own, smoothly on their own. The important thing is that you simply don't hold back. You give your whole mind, your whole heart to what you're doing right now. This is an attitude that you should develop to the entire practice. When you're sweeping up around the monastery, be fully there. Have a sense of your body, the whole body, involved in the sweeping. When working in the kitchen, doing whatever chores need to be done, be fully there. Sometimes we notice that we're doing a lot of sweeping while someone else is doing less sweeping, but remember, we're not doing it for them, we're doing it for us. Here's an opportunity to develop your goodness, wholehearted goodness, wholesome goodness. So take as much as you can by giving as much of yourself as you can, and you're going to gain a lot. The same with the precepts, especially for the monks. Sometimes they seem pretty daunting. There are lots and lots of precepts, and when you're first ordained, it seems like a huge demand. You used to have 5, 8, or 10 precepts. Now you have 227, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It may seem superhuman, but it's not. Remember that the precepts are not meant to tie you down. The fact that you're following the precepts makes other people more inspired to support your practice, so the precepts give you freedom. I remember when I was a young monk, the first time that notion occurred to me totally changed my attitude toward the precepts. In the beginning, I put up with them grudgingly, not wholeheartedly. But then I realized, 1, I had the freedom to meditate all day because of the precepts. And 2, as I lived in the community, I noticed that whenever there was strife, whenever there was disturbance in the community, it was because somebody was breaking the precepts. Because the precepts are designed for freedom, the more you give to them, the more freedom you get, so you observe them wholeheartedly. You do your duties wholeheartedly. You're generous wholeheartedly. Follow the precepts wholeheartedly. It's a lot easier then to sit down and meditate wholeheartedly, fully present, with no regrets from the course of the day, no issues brought in from the course of the day, so you can give yourself fully to being right here. The whole body, your awareness of the whole body, can be fully given over to the breath so that there's a strong sense of oneness. The breath is one. The body is one single sensation of awareness. The mind is one. Your heart is one. There's an intensity that comes from that. I've heard people say they don't like the term concentration for samadhi. It sounds too tense. They prefer lucid calm or collectedness. But the actual quality of samadhi can be very intense. When you fully give yourself to it, there's an intensity of well-being that comes with that, along with a sharpness of alertness that you don't get otherwise. So the more fully you give this your whole heart, your whole mind, then the more fully you'll reap the benefits. All I. December 11th, 2022. When the Buddha defines concentration or samadhi, he defines it as siddhasakagata. Sometimes that term is translated as one-pointedness of mind. Ika would be one, and aga is often thought to mean point, but aga doesn't mean point. It means the summit of something, like the ridge on a roof or the summit of a mountain. It also means a gathering place, which seems to be the translation closest to what the Buddha's trying to get at here. There's a gathering place for the appositha, there's a gathering place for meals, all those are agas. In the case of concentration, you create a gathering place for the mind. You choose a single object and gather all your mental activities around it. Or, as the Buddha also says, you enter and dwell in it. The reason we say it's not one-pointed is because when you look at the analogies the Buddha gives for the mind in concentration, they're all expansive. A lake filled with cool water, lotuses drenched with cool water from their roots to their tips, a person entirely surrounded by white cloth. That last one is the image for the most solid of the jhanas, the fourth. That's where we're headed. We want to be in a position where we feel surrounded by our object, as when you're with the breath. We talk about watching the breath, and it gives the impression that you have an eye in the mind that's looking at something outside of the eye. Its focal point is outside. Try to imagine instead that the eye is being focused inside the eye itself and it's aware all around. That's the quality of awareness we're trying to develop. It's like when people go into the forest to track animals or to look for mushrooms. They have to develop what's called scatter vision, where you're fully present in the present moment and you're aware of your whole range of vision. That takes a lot of concentration. Any thoughts coming up that would pull you away from that expanded state have to be dropped. You're not at any one point in space, but you are at one point in time. You're right here, fully dwelling in the present moment. That's where we're headed. Think, too, of the description of the Buddha as an all-around eye. Back in those days, they had the belief that devas were eyes all around. They could see with their whole bodies. This image of the Buddha has that same connotation. He sees all around. After all, if you're going to be looking at your defilements, you have to see all around. If you're focused on one spot, your defilements have plenty of places to hide away. It's like a being on a stage where there's one spotlight. All kinds of characters can hide in the dark. So the quality we're trying to arrive at is fully present and expanded. But in the beginning, the mind has a tendency, one it's picked up from long experience, of being focused on one spot. So you give it one spot, but from that spot, you survey the whole body. The third step in breath meditation, as the Buddha says, is to breathe in and out sensitive to the entire body. A good way to build up to that whole body awareness and whole body sensitivity is to go through the body section by section first, because many parts of the body tend to be hidden, kept in the dark, and if you really want your awareness to be all around, you've got to cast light on those dark spots too. You can think of the chakras to begin with. Ajahn Lee mentions the chakras, beginning with the one right above the navel and then on up. He doesn't mention any of the lower chakras, which might have been considered impolite in Thai society. But any spot in the body where there seems to be a center of energy, focus your attention there. Think of the breath radiating from that spot as you breathe in. If there are any obstructions to it spreading out to fill the whole body, think of those obstructions dissolving away. Then move up to the next center of energy, and then the next. Then you can go through the body in other spots as well, to the right, to the left. Sometimes it's good to compare the left and the right side, like your left shoulder and your right shoulder. Do they feel the same? Does one seem to be holding more tension or tightness than the other side? If so, can you relax it? Think of the blood flowing freely in there, dissolving away the tension. You want to get the reflex that wherever you focus your attention, any tension in the body relaxes right there. This counters our usual tendency, which is that when you're focused on one spot in the body, you tend to tense up around it. You want to think the opposite. Wherever you're focused, things are wide open, free, with a sense of energy radiating from the spot where you're focused. And again, think of the image of the eye focused inside the eye itself, or a camera lens focused inside the camera lens. As you go through the body, hitting the major spots, then try to find the minor spots, the little spots, say, between fingers, between the toes, inside your elbow, inside your shoulders, all the little muscles in the head. Make a survey so that you're really familiar with how things feel everywhere in the body. In modern society, we tend to be really disembodied, especially as all of our attention gets drawn into screens, video games, emails, online videos. Our attention gets cast outside, and the body becomes unknown territory, like those old maps where they just had the outlines of the continents, surrounding huge blank spaces where they wrote across, "Here be tigers." Well, there will be tigers inside your body if you don't get to know the body really well, because there will be places for your defilements to hide out. Wherever there's a lack of awareness, mental states can also hide out along with the tension, so try to make your awareness more all-encompassing. When you've done your survey of the different parts of the body, think of one spot in the body as being your center, and your awareness radiating out from that spot in all directions, the all-around eye looking in all directions, aware in all directions, clear in all directions. That image of the man surrounded by a white cloth. Some people actually have a sense of a white light that develops as the mind gets centered. Other people don't have white light, but they do have a sense of everything being really clear. You want to maintain the sense of everything having equal weight and importance, as in the passage where the Buddha says, "What's above is like what's below, what's below is like what's above." There are many ways you can interpret that passage, but one of them is that everything gets equal attention, as best as you can muster. Think of every cell in the body breathing in, breathing out, and they're all breathing in unison. Every little cell is aware, it's a little eye. All the eyes function together so that everything is clear. When your awareness is spread out like this, enlarged like this, then it's less likely to go wandering off to the past or future. It's when your awareness is small that it can travel around. It pulls out of the present moment and goes here, goes there. But if you fully inhabit the body, you have to be fully present, and it's hard to go to the past or future as long as your awareness is enlarged. You'll find that, as your awareness gets more centered and all around like this, it's harder and harder to think, but for the time being, you don't have to think. You want to get used to being fully present with this sensation of the body as you feel it all around, as you sense it all around. In the canon, they tend to mix up the senses. They talk about seeing with your body. Think of the body as an eye, and it sees all around itself. In that way, you develop the quality of concentration that really is strengthening. It pulls you out of a lot of your usual ways of thinking and gives you a really good place to rest, to be solid and strong. So hold these images in mind: the eye focused inside itself, the all-around eye, the body wrapped in a white cloth. They give you an idea where you're headed in the concentration and what kind of concentration it is. It doesn't bear down hard on any one spot. Wherever it's focused, and there will be one spot in the body that tends to get a little bit more attention than the rest, make that spot wide open. Wherever you focus your attention, you disperse any tension that seems to be developing there, and then learn to stay right here, dispersing. There'll be thoughts in the back of the mind saying, "This is stupid. Nothing's happening." Well, nothing has to happen for the time being. It's good to get the mind used to being in this state, so that when it leaves this state, it can see things clearly as the mind begins to start thinking about things again. You can see why it picks up a particular topic, and you can ask yourself, do you really want to go there? You have this other alternative. That's what's so good about the Buddhist teachings. They give us other alternatives to our normal ways of thinking and relating to our thoughts. They pull us outside of ourselves because our normal ways of thinking tend to focus on becoming. In other words, you have a particular desire, and there's a world in your imagination that contains the desired object. Then you go into that world, take on a role there, and inhabit it, and you can get stuck in some pretty weird worlds. But the Buddha's giving you this alternative where you can get out, refresh your senses, refresh your mind, and you begin to see that the other worlds you used to inhabit are really strange. You wonder, why would you want to inhabit them? This is one of the ways that you can pull yourself out of some pretty unhealthy mind states. So try to work on the skill of developing this alternative, where, instead of being focused on what your thoughts are, you're focused on fully inhabiting the body, with your awareness spreading in all directions. Front and back, top and bottom are all equal, and everything is clear all around. Ironclad technique versus no technique. May 3rd, 2022. When you're practicing meditation, there are two extremes to be avoided. One is the attitude that you're given a technique and you have to follow it to the letter without any variations. The other is the attitude that there is no technique. Just be aware of whatever is coming up, telling yourself not to do anything in particular. In neither way can you really develop discernment. As the Buddha said, the Dhamma is to be nourished within you by committing yourself and then reflecting. When he teaches that principle to Rahula, he teaches him to look at his actions, to look first at his intentions, then at his actions as he's doing them, and then, when they're done, to see if he's causing any harm. If he's causing harm, he's got to change his ways, to consult with someone else, and to make up his mind not to make that mistake again. In this way, your reflection is meant to alter your actions. You become more and more sensitive to your actions, your contribution to the present moment. And you can begin to see what's actually causing suffering right now. You can begin to see basically what you're doing, what's causing suffering, and what's not causing suffering. You get an inkling of cause and effect, which you don't get if you're told simply to follow a technique and not to pass any judgment on it, just to do the technique. At the same time, if you're told just to be aware of whatever, you have no sense of what you're doing. The point to having a technique is that it focuses you on your actions, what you're doing in the present moment. This is where you can see the processes of fabrication in action. This is where you can see your intentions in action, all the factors of dependent co-arising that lead up to contact and can shape the course of what's going to happen after the contact, whether it's going to lead to suffering or to no suffering. When you have a technique, you're made more aware of these things. This is why the ideal approach is to have a technique that allows you to learn how to play with it, make variations in it. This fits in with the analogies that the Buddha uses when he's teaching meditation, the analogy of the cook, the analogy of the carpenter, people who've developed skills based on their powers of observation and who make adjustments based on what they observe. This was Ajahn Lee's approach when he taught the basic steps in Method 2, although maybe the word step is not quite right, because he didn't insist that they had to be followed in any particular order. There's 7 component factors that you put together to get the mind to settle down. But then, in his later teachings, he would vary them. In the 7 steps he talks about starting with the breath at the back of the neck going down the spine. As I've noted before, he developed this method after curing himself of a heart attack. Anyone who's had heart problems knows that the back of the neck is tension central when you have a heart condition. But it's also important that you learn how to straighten your spine. One of the most conducive ways of straightening your spine is to think of the breath coming in the back of the neck and then going down. But then there are other times when the back feels weak. As Ajahn Lee noted in some of his Dhamma talks, in that case you want to start with another kind of breath, the breath in the soles of the feet going up the legs and then up the spine, or the breath starting at the navel and going up the front of the body, whereas in the 7 steps he talked about the breath coming in at the heart and then going down through the intestines. So there are lots of different ways you can play with the breath. Some of them have to do with the state of your health, the state of your body. Some of them have to do with the state of your mind. Sometimes the mind needs to be made more alert, and at other times it needs to be calmed and soothed. Different ways of breathing will function in different ways, and you learn this by playing with the breath and gladdening the mind. If you simply put the mind into shackles, saying, "You've got to do this, 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 and nothing else," there's no joy in that kind of practice. But the pleasure that comes from mastering a skill is one of the highest joys. For a lot of us, our joys come from consuming, taking things in. But there's a higher level of joy that comes from mastering a skill, knowing that you can handle different situations. You've got techniques, plural, that you can apply, depending on what the situation is. This is how you develop your discernment. This is how you see cause and effect. Think about what scientists do when they want to see what causes what. They don't sit there simply watching something or putting something through one particular test. They'll try different tests, approaching things from different angles, so that they can see which connections are simply happenstance and which are really causal. So as you come to the breath, remember that this is an area where you have a technique to start with, to get yourself sensitive to what you're contributing to the present, but that you also have to use your powers of observation and you can make variations. This way, you become your own independent observer. After all, what are we looking for? We're looking for the end of suffering. And who can know better than you whether you're suffering? But if you're not well trained in being observant, how can you even know? There are many subtle levels of suffering that can go right past you if you're not observant, if you're not sensitive. If you're simply told to follow a particular technique, then basically it becomes the responsibility of the teacher to confirm whether you've attained a particular level or not. That's handing the power over to the teacher. Actually, meditation is meant to hand power over to you, but also to make you worthy of that power, capable of handling that power. As the Buddha said, it's when you reach stream entry that you become independent in the Dhamma. Ajahn Lee's analogy is that it's like reaching maturity. You're now old enough to function as an adult, and adults don't simply do what they're told. True adults have a range of skills that they've mastered, starting with techniques they've been taught, and then learning how to vary them so that they become their own skills. They become the judges of what approach is required at any particular time and what counts as good results. If you're not sensitive to what you're putting into the present moment, how are you going to know whether a particular state is fabricated or not? There are strong states of oneness that can come in the meditation, and the Buddha says, watch out, these are fabricated. The highest oneness, he says, is a fabricated state, so you have to see the fabrications. You have to learn how to be observant. And to learn how to become observant, you're given a technique and told to play with it. This is how you become independent in the Dhamma. This is how your commitment and your reflection lead you to attaining the Dhamma, a Dhamma you can really depend on. A divine seat. June 2nd, 2023. A common meditation instruction is that you should sit with whatever comes up. But the important thing is that you have a good place to sit, a solid place to sit, so that whatever comes up doesn't blow you away. Some things come up and they're very strong. You need to be able to resist their strength, to have a way of counteracting them and, when you can, taking them apart. The Buddha talks about getting the mind into concentration as a divine seat. Get the mind into the first jhana, and there's a sense of ease and rapture filling the body. You can work it through the body. When you're sitting in that state, you're in a divine seat. So create a divine seat for yourself tonight. Focus on the breath. Notice where you feel it. Remember that mindfulness and concentration are things that you construct. You don't just sit here waiting for them to come on their own. You have to give rise to them. They're the seat you have to put together. As the Buddha said, you direct your thoughts to the breath and then you evaluate. On the one hand, you evaluate the breath. How does it feel? What kind of breathing would feel good now? This is an area where you can experiment. He calls the breath bodily fabrication, and the word fabrication is often equated with intention. There's an intentional element in the way you breathe. For most of us, we let it go on automatic pilot. But even when it's on automatic pilot, there's something inside you that directs it now to come in, now to go out. You want to find where those directions are coming from, so experiment. See what feels good right now. You can try soft breathing, heavy breathing, fast, slow, deep, shallow, long, or short. Or simply pose the question to the mind. What would feel really good right now? See how the body responds. Open it up to all kinds of possibilities. This is one of the duties of meditation, to expand your imagination as to what's possible. You have potentials here in the body right now, potentials in the mind right now, which, if you activate them, can give rise to a sense of intense well-being. Where are those potentials and how do you activate them? If you can get your imagination captured by this question, attracted by this question, so that you become inquisitive, that can fill up the space in the present moment so that random thoughts and old emotions don't have an opening to come barging in. So take an interest in this. What kind of breathing really would feel good right now? When it feels good, how do you maintain it? How do you let that sense of good feeling spread around the body? Ajahn Lee recommends having it come down the spine and out the legs, but there are other passages where he says to think of it coming from the soles of the feet up through the legs and the spine. That gives you something else to experiment with. When you breathe in, what direction should the breath flow so that it feels good inside, feels solid, so that the body is in harmony? In addition to evaluating the breath, you can evaluate the state of your mind. What does it need right now? To be gladdened, to be made steadier? Does it need gentle reminders to stay with the breath, or does it need more forceful ones? You find that, in using directed thought and evaluation, you're working with three things here. Bodily fabrication, as I said, and then verbal fabrication, directed thought and evaluation itself. That's the Buddhist term for how you talk to yourself, the comments you make, the questions you ask, the answers you give to those questions. You direct your attention someplace and then you discuss it with yourself. Then there are perceptions and feelings, which are mental fabrications. Perceptions are the mental images you hold in mind, like the image of the breath energy going down the spine, or the image of the breath coming up through the soles of the feet or filling the chest, bathing the body. Think of the breath as being all around you. We do have this tendency to think of the mind or ourselves being in one part of the body, looking at the breath in another part of the body, in front of us, but the breath can also flow all around you. Hold that perception in mind and see what it does. So we've got bodily fabrication, verbal fabrication, the directed thought and evaluation, and then mental fabrication, perceptions and feelings. Here the feelings are feelings of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. You're trying to emphasize the potential for pleasure here. Here again, the Buddha says, feelings can come and go willy-nilly, but you can also induce them by the way you focus on them, by the way you place labels on them. You've probably noticed this yourself. If there's a pain that comes in, and you don't know where it's coming from, you get upset by it. But if a masseur or masseuse massaging you created the same pain, you might actually enjoy it. That's because of the perceptions you have around it. So learn how to perceive the feelings in the body in a positive way. This way, you create your safe space, you create your divine seat, so that when emotions do come up, and they will when the mind gets quiet, when it doesn't have the usual surface disturbances that you generate as you go through the day, which keep a lot of subconscious things down in the basement, you won't get knocked over by them. When the surface disturbances are gone, then what's down in the bottom of the lake can come welling up. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. In the beginning, it's hard to get a handle on it, so you just hold on to whatever part of the body you can make comfortable through the way you breathe or the way you focus on it, and just hang out there for a while. But then you have to realize that these emotions coming up are made out of those same kinds of fabrications that you're using to construct your concentration. That gives you a handle on them. You can begin to analyze them. When a negative emotion comes up, how does it change the way you breathe? Can you change it back to something good? And how are you talking to yourself? What images do you have in your mind? What feelings in the body and feelings in the mind are you focusing on? Can you change the focus? Can you change the inner conversation? You'll notice that a lot of emotions have a story aligned to them. They've been through the mind many times before, and it's often the same story again and again, and it seems designed to get you upset. When I was first staying with Ajahn Fuang, meditating up on the mountain alone, a lot of issues from childhood, my teenage years, college years, came welling up into the mind. At first I was upset. I wanted to get the mind on the breath, but this other stuff was getting in the way. But then I began to realize that this stuff had to be dealt with, and what I had to do was get a new perspective on it. Ajahn Fuang was helpful. He would say, look at these things in terms of your karma, the things that happened to you that you felt victimized by. Maybe you did that kind of karma in the past. That thought changes the story. You realize that these issues go back and back and back, and there's so much back and forth that we have no idea how things began. There's that famous story in the commentaries of one woman chasing another woman around, wanting to kill her child. The woman with the child goes running into the monastery where the Buddha is staying and bows down to his feet. The other woman comes up and hovers in the background, afraid to get nearer. The Buddha asks, do you realize how many of each other's children you've killed over your many, many lifetimes? You've been through all this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You have no memory of who began this back and forth. Why continue it? So realize, when things come welling up, that you don't know the whole story, you know only part of it. Then the question is, do you want to continue it? Why? Part of the mind says, I want things to get settled, to come to closure. But there's no closure in the world, aside from entering into nibbana. Still, you can have some measure of closure when you say, okay, I just don't want to go back and forth on this anymore. Changing the storyline like this makes it a different story, and it has a different impact on the mind. What you're trying to do is to remove all the Velcro from the story. Then you spread lots of goodwill to everyone involved, yourself, the other people. As the Buddha said, when you realize you've done something unskillful, the best response is to recognize it as unskillful and make the resolve not to repeat it. That'll have a good impact on your karma right there. The fact that you recognize something wrong as wrong, that's right view. The resolve not to repeat it, that shows a change of heart, that's right resolve. Then you spread goodwill to everybody involved, yourself, the other people. You spread it to yourself so that you don't keep on harassing yourself with these thoughts. You spread it to the other people involved, and then you spread it to all people you might get involved with in the future. That's more right resolve, and that disentangles a lot of the stories, because they are constructs too. Just because something comes welling up unbidden in the mind doesn't mean it's any more natural than anything else. It's just a construct, one coming from the past. What we're trying to do here is learn how to construct better things. The seats that we've been constructing in the past are pretty bad, wobbly, and uncomfortable. Here the Buddha is teaching what he calls the divine seat, divine right concentration. When you're well established here, then things don't blow you around. Ajahn Chah, one of the forest masters, has a related image. He says it's as if you're in a house. There's just one seat in the house, and you're in the seat. As long as you don't let anybody else lure you out of the seat, you're fine. You're the one in charge. Everybody else is standing around waiting for your orders. You can tell everyone else to come, tell them to go. But if one of them slips into the seat and pushes you out, or lures you out, you're in trouble. They're giving the orders then. You're the one who has to run around. It's like that famous story in Thailand. There's a character in Thai literature named Sri Thanissaro who was famous for the tricks he played on other people, including the king. He'd almost always get away with it because he was so clever. Once he was down in the river, and the king comes along with his retinue. He sees Sri Thanissaro down in the river and says, "I know you're clever, but there's no way you could get me to go down in the river with you." Sri Thanissaro thinks for a bit and then says, "You know, you're right. But if you got down into the river, I could get you out." The king says, "Oh yeah." He goes down into the river. Then he says, "Okay, now try to get me out." And Sri Thanissaro says, "Well, I've already got you down into the river. Whether you get out or not, that's your business. So watch out for your defilements that will lure you out of the seat and take the seat in your place. You stay here. Learn how to construct a good seat so that it's a good place to stay. The breath is comfortable. It fills the body with a sense of ease and harmony. The mind is engaged in maintaining that sense of ease and comfort. And as you're busy constructing this good seat, you find that you don't have much time for other things. When they do a barge in, you can take them apart. If you can't figure out how to take them apart quite yet, then just hold on to your seat. That way you can stay safe.